In the last episode I released on the Anglo-Saxons, we covered Alfred the Great and his epic war against the Vikings. This episode will explore his successor, Edward the Elder, who continued the fight. Edward the Elder was an Anglo-Saxon king who reigned in Britain from 899 to 924 AD. Known to history as Edward the Elder because he was the first Edward in this dynasty of Anglo-Saxon kings, which I guess made him the eldest. Not to be confused with Edward I, who was a much later king. The numbering of kings in English history did not become a thing until after the Norman conquest of 1066, which is why these kings all have weird names like the Elder, the Martyr, or the Confessor. Edward's time, however, was one of great turmoil due to the Viking invaders. So, a quick recap. Edward's father, Alfred the Great, ruled the Kingdom of Wessex, the last Anglo-Saxon kingdom during the Viking invasions of Britain. And even Wessex was overrun in 878 AD. But Alfred didn't give up. He fought on and eventually reconquered the kingdom, a new kingdom, the Kingdom of the Anglo-Saxons. And by the time Alfred died in 899 AD, the land that would one day become England had been split in two. The Kingdom of the Anglo-Saxons in the west and the Danelaw in the east, where the Vikings lived under their own laws and customs. The kingdom Edward inherited had once been two Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, Wessex and Mercia. And although they were one kingdom under Edward, there were still two active seats of power. Edward ruled from his capital at Winchester in Wessex. But there was a second court in Mercia, headed by Aethelflaed, Lord of the Mercians. Wessex and Mercia were unified by the marriage between Aethelred and Aethelflaed. She was the eldest daughter of Alfred the Great, and therefore Edward's sister, and she would play a leading role in Mercian affairs. Almost as soon as Edward took the throne, however, he faced a rebellion from his cousin Aethelwald. Aethelwald's father, King Aethelred, had ruled Wessex, but died back in 871 AD. Back then, Aethelwald had been the rightful heir. However, he was just a small boy, and at a time when Wessex was in a fight for its very existence against the Viking invaders. Therefore, it had been agreed that Edward's father, Alfred, would rule, with the understanding that Aethelred's children would succeed him. Under this agreement, Aethelwald would be next in line to rule. However, fast forward to 899 AD, Alfred wanted to kickstart his own dynasty, and so in his will left the kingdom to Edward. Succession to the eldest son hadn't been fully established yet, and although it was still hereditary, the Witan, which was the council of nobles, still had to agree, and in this case they honoured Alfred's will, and Edward took the throne. Aethelwald wasted no time. He began by abducting a nun from a monastery. A strange way to start a rebellion, you might think, but it was probably the case that she was Edward's sister, Aethelgifu, who had devoted herself to the church. I guess Aethelwald intended to marry her to strengthen his claim to the throne. Then, he and his supporters seized the royal manor at Wimborne. Edward mustered a force and marched to meet him, and probably quicker than Aethelwald anticipated. With Edward's much larger force camped outside, Aethelwald simply didn't have the numbers to face him. So, under the cover of darkness, Aethelwald escaped and made his way to York. The nun he left behind. At York, Aethelwald was received by the Vikings, and it seems that they saw him and his claim as an opportunity for another invasion into the Saxon kingdom. And so, an alliance was formed. In the meantime, in 900 AD, Edward had himself officially crowned at Kingston. By 902 AD, Aethelwald's supporters had grown in number. He had been joined by the Viking king Erik. Together, they led a large force consisting of both Vikings and Saxons into Edward's kingdom. As they went, they ravaged the land and seized what they could, before returning back the way they came. However, Edward retaliated. He marched his own force into East Anglia, plundering the countryside. The two armies met in what has become known as the Battle of the Somme. This battle took place somewhere in East Anglia, but exactly where we do not know. The fighting was fierce, and things went badly for Edward, so bad in fact that he ordered a retreat. Despite this, however, both Aethelwald and King Eorik were killed in battle, and therefore Edward's aim had been achieved. His claim to the throne, at least, was secured. However, he had lost the battle, so it wasn't until 906 AD until Edward gave the Vikings treasure in exchange for peace. But in 909 AD, Edward was ready to fight again. He launched a bloody and devastating campaign into Northumbria. For over a month, he attacked every settlement in his path in order to weaken Viking control in the region. The next year, in 910 AD, the Vikings took revenge and attacked with a large force from Northumbria. They marched into the kingdom of the Anglo-Saxons, causing devastation where they went. On the way back, however, Edward, with a large army of his own, cut them off in modern-day Wolverhampton, and so began the Battle of Tettenhall. The Vikings formed a line, waiting for the rest of their army to catch up. The Saxons wasted no time. They went on the offensive and overwhelmed them. It was a Viking massacre, and the Saxons were victorious. The next year, in 911 AD, Aethelflaed, the lord of the Mercians, died. The sources suggest he had been ill for some time. His wife, Aethelflaed, sister of Edward and daughter of Alfred the Great, took over the running of Mercia, operating under the title Lady of the Mercians. She even took part in military affairs. Back in 907 AD, Aethelflaed had organised the rebuilding of the fortifications at Chester, and it was just as well, because later that year the Vikings attacked the town. She led the town's defences and repelled the attack. And back in 909 AD, whilst on campaign with Edward in Northumbria, she organised an expedition to recover the bones of St Oswald and have them brought back to Mercia. She had them buried in Gloucester, which was another town that she'd ordered the building of fortifications. Edward and his sister Aethelflaed made an effective team. While Aethelflaed and the Mercians took care of the kingdom's interests in the north, Edward did the same from the south. Together, they also continued to expand the burh network, strengthening existing ones and building new ones. The first burhs were built by Alfred. They were fortified settlements built to repel Viking attacks. Due to the safety they provided, they became economic havens for traders. Edward and Aethelflaed, however, were now building them as a strategy of conquest to demoralise the Vikings and extend Anglo-Saxon territory. In 917 AD, the Vikings launched a major attack on one such burh called Towcester. But it was all in vain. The Saxons successfully defended the settlement, and it was another significant victory for Edward. Also that year, Aethelflaed attacked the Vikings at Derby. The Mercians broke the town's defences, and after some fierce fighting, Derby was taken. Due to Edward's success with the burhs, the Vikings had fortified a base of their own at Tempsford. However, later that year, Edward's forces launched an attack, storming the burh and winning another victory. In 918 AD, the Vikings of Leicester submitted to Aethelflaed, and the town was taken without a fight. However, 918 was also the year that Aethelflaed, Lady of the Mercians, died. Aethelflaed had a daughter called Elfwin, and to keep some degree of independence, the Mercian chose Alfwin to succeed her. But Edward was having none of it. He marched into Mercia and took control. Elfwin was removed from taking any kind of power. We don't know exactly what happened to her, but if I was to guess, she probably ended up in a nunnery. By 920 AD, Edward had reached the pinnacle of his conquests. The strategy of expanding the burh network had paid off. Edward had expanded Anglo-Saxon territory and proven himself to be a force to be reckoned with. Edward the Elder, king of the Anglo-Saxons, passed away in 924 AD. Through blood and sweat, he and his sister Aethelflaed had expanded the kingdom and made significant strides towards the unification of England. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to like, share, subscribe and comment. Have a great day.